Recording in progress.
Bonjour and good afternoon. My name is Eric Alcott. I am the Associate Vice President for Advancement at the University at Buffalo. Welcome to our joint virtual speakers event today, the evolution of the U.S.-Canada relationship. I want to thank our hosts, Albany Club, HEC Montreal, Rideau Club, St. James Club, and the University of Buffalo. I also want to thank our moderator and presenters who had prepared robust topics and discussion points for today's program. At the end of the 4 presentations, there will be time for questions. You may wait until then to ask your questions, or you may post them in the chat room and we will pick them up there. Please be sure to mute your sound during the presentations. We will also be recording the program. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Steve Van Houten. Steve is the former president of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association and former GM executive. Steve, thank you for moderating today.
Thank you very much, Eric, and I'll echo your thanks to the sponsoring organization. I'd also like to thank the participants for joining us today for this event. We have 4 very distinguished, very knowledgeable and capable speakers for you, and I'm sure you're going to find their presentations thought-provoking and very interesting. As Eric said, we certainly look forward to audience participation. Please do ask questions, hold them till the end. Of course, you can use the chat function at any time, which is at the bottom of your screens. You can even raise your hand in using the little reaction button that's down in the bottom right. That's where it is on my screen anyway. So each of our presenters will give a 10-minute talk And then we'll take questions that you can direct to any of them or to the panel at large. Our speakers are Lisa Raitt, who's Vice Chair of Investment Banking at CIBC, Martin Coiteux, who is the Head of Economic Analysis and Global Strategy at the Caisse de dépôt et placement. He's speaking to us from Montreal. Catherine Friedman is our presenter from Buffalo, and she's an Associate Professor of Law and Policy at the university there. And finally, Trevin Stratton, who's the lead of the Economic Advisory practice at Deloitte Canada in Ottawa. So our first speaker, Lisa Raitt, has a particularly distinguished background. I won't give you all of it, but I'll give you a little bit more than you've seen on the flyer that enticed you to sign up for this event. Lisa hails from Nova Scotia, one of my favorite parts of Canada, and holds degrees from a number of Canadian universities, winding up with the Osgoode Hall Law School. She began her career with the Toronto Port Authority, where she became the CEO, and then entered public life as a member of parliament from Milton, and for a number of years. And during her time in parliament, she was also spending time as a Minister of the Crown, holding a number of cabinet positions in the Harper government, where she was Minister of Natural Resources and Minister of Transport and Minister of Labor. She joined CIBC in her current role almost 2 years ago. So Lisa, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I'm delighted to be on such a distinguished panel. And I'm glad that you let folks know that I'm probably going to be coming at this question with the lens of being a cabinet minister or a former politician. It's not so much about my work now at CIBC. It's really my observations based upon, I guess, my experience, my lived experience as being both a cabinet minister, member of parliament, and dabbling quite significantly in cross-border trade. There are three things that occupy my thoughts right now when we talk about the US-Canadian relationship. And every team of presidents and prime ministers change the relationship just a little bit and build on it from the past prime minister presidential kind of dyad. But this one is very different. And it's, I think it's a unique situation that we find ourselves in. So the first thing that occupies my mind has to do with our land border, longest shared, land border in the world, undefended land border in the world. And we understand very clearly now the importance of that land border, having just gone through the pandemic, where we were actually trying to ensure that we didn't have folks with COVID coming across either to Canada or into the United States. And as such, we saw a prolonged period of shutdown, much longer than what we saw when we had a 9/11. The natural tension on the border is this. You want to have a secure border. It has to be secure to any threats to either country, and it has to be secure for the purposes of our own sovereignty. But at the same time, we are a close trading partnership and close trading nations. And as a result, that border has to be flexible enough to allow for meaningful trade to go back and forth between the two countries. And in some cases, such as auto parts, the same vehicle can go across that border many, many times prior to it actually being completed. So it's a very close relationship with lots of concerns about whether or not you have the appropriate amount of security versus the appropriate amount of trade going through. In the years in which I served as Minister of Transport, and before that, and Minister of Labor, we actually had an agreement with the United States that allowed us to do some really important work about ensuring that that border was secure, but at the same time, it also allowed trade to go through. And as a result, bureaucrats on both There, I'm back again. I hope you can hear me now. For some reason, I was muted by the host. But nonetheless, usually it's further on in my discussion when I get the hook like that. So it's, as I was saying about the border, what I find interesting right now is that I just don't see that amount of collaboration that is needed between the United States and Canada at the bureaucratic level to ensure that there is a forum in which to discuss matters that may come up regarding security. And it really is something that's important to both nations, and I'd like to see that. And it underscores the relationship that politicians have. The second thing that's occupying my thought right now is how climate change and the transition in energy is going to be impacted in both countries. I would give you this opinion, and it's purely my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone, but I truly believe that in Canada, we have already dealt with the why do we need to act in climate change. I think Canadians understand it. They've had 3 elections where they voted in favor of a carbon tax, so they know, and they are fully engaged on the climate file and understand, at least notionally, that this is something that we want to strive for. I would submit it's not the same in the United States, that there may be pockets of people who definitely understand the urgency and want to make sure that they're going to be doing everything they can to reduce their emissions. However, for a strong proportion of the population, it's not as automatic that folks believe that there should be action and a little bit of pain involved in transitioning out of fossil fuels. That being said, the way in which to deal with that, of course, is to make the case that this is an economic opportunity for the nation. And as a result, there is going to be, I think, a very interesting period of time, tension between the United States and Canada. And I would submit it could be the Wild West in terms of the United States wanting to make that economic argument that there is an opportunity. And the best way to shore that up is by saying we're going to provide incentives that, quite frankly, Canada just simply can't match when it comes to R&D or clean tech. And the second part is protectionism. And a really good example of that is the clause in the recent legislation that went through Congress that indicates there would be a significant subsidy for EVs, provided that it is an American plant with American labor that makes it, which causes a whole bunch of problems in Canada, not only for the assembly side, but also from auto parts. And the reason being is that if you're no longer bound to 75% North American made, which is the NAFTA 2 agreement, then you can import your parts from anywhere in the world. And as such, you could have a situation where a fully assembled domestic vehicle in the United States has a lot of parts from countries that simply aren't Canada or Mexico. The last thing I would say is that the nature of the relationship I find to be interesting at this point in time. And I only bring it up because of something that happened yesterday. Yesterday here in Canada, our Minister of Agriculture took a very, I would say, strong move and has banned the export of PEI potatoes to the United States. And the reason why is because there's concern that at a couple of farms in PEI, there is this fungus called potato wart, which if it infects seed potatoes going across, it could really destroy crops and they don't grow to optimal levels, and it's a problem. Why I find that interesting is that this isn't a case where the United States at the border is saying, hey, we're really concerned about these potatoes, therefore we're going to turn it back. And in fact, what the minister said was she said, I'm going to stop the export myself because I can't be sure of how long it will take the United States to lift such an exemption if they were the ones to impose it. That is fascinating to me. There are a lot of things cabinet ministers take into consideration when they're making these kinds of decisions. It has to be a pretty strong concern that the minister has in order for a government to take the heat from the province and from farmers in Prince Edward Island to ban the export of their potato. And as a result, to me, that adds a signal that there is great concerns about whether or not the relationship regarding Canada and the US is as strong as it used to be when it comes to trade across the border. I could also point to Line 5, and I'd point to the Maine referendum on transmission lines here as well as 2 other good examples of that dialogue, maybe being friendly, but certainly not as not going in the direction that Canada needs when it comes to their economy. So there's a very inward-looking United States at this point in time. I look forward to any questions that you may have, and I want to again thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Wow, what a great way to start. A couple of really interesting points you've raised. The the issues around the land border and balancing flexibility with security, climate change and energy transition, some differences between Canada and the United States there, and the interesting times ahead where there's some other areas you've highlighted where things aren't necessarily seen or done in exactly the same way and on both sides of the border. And a really topical illustration of that you brought up respecting PEI and the potato export ban and the reasons for it and the concerns around that issue had that action not been taken. I bet you we're going to have a few questions for you at the end of this. So thank you again. Now I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Martin Coitu. Martin is at the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec. He's another well-educated person with a PhD from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. He has been a professor at HEC in Montreal, one of the co-sponsors of this session, and has worked as an economist at the Bank of Canada. He too has been in public life as a member of the Assemblée nationale in Quebec, where he was Treasury Board and also Minister of Public Security and Municipal Affairs. And he assumed his current position with the Caisse, which is one of Canada's largest and most important institutional investment organizations in 2019. Martin, we look forward to your comments.
Okay, can you hear me? All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very, very interesting discussion. Just heard Lisa, wonderful, very interesting. And I think that there will be some slight overlap, but I will come from a different perspective. So let me start just by providing some elements of context about what the pandemic brought to us, to both our countries, as a general way of introducing my topic here. I would argue that the pandemic has essentially reinforced or accelerated existing trends in most cases, instead of creating new ones, except for a few ones that I will emphasize. One of the things, for example, that has been accelerated on both sides of the border, but I would argue internationally also, is the digitalization of business models. This was going on before, it's just going on at a much faster pace today. The same thing with e-commerce, which is closely related. Maybe one change which affects both our countries, and to an extent which I would say is larger than in Europe or Asia, for example, is this shift towards a less office-centric and more hybrid forms of work organization. I think it's going to have a huge impact on our societies on both sides of the border. This is certainly something which is relatively new. But I would argue that it's not that it's completely new, but I would argue that an important change also that has been brought on the policy front. As we all know, on both sides of the border, to address the problems of pandemic on the economic and the fact that people were losing their jobs or they were forced to stay home, they couldn't earn their income. One of the things that our governments have done, obviously, is step in with huge fiscal packages, aided by a lot of monetary support that is even continuing nowadays, and providing major transfers to businesses and households. And that meant, obviously, a huge involvement of our government in the economic sphere. And I think that even if we're going to see some retrenchment from those hyperactive monetary and fiscal policies in the months ahead of us and in the years ahead of us, I think that part of it will stay. I really think that we are entering a new era of larger government involvement in the economy, in our societies, and it will probably mark a break with what we had in the last couple of decades, for example. Now, is that bad news? Not necessarily. It depends a lot in what areas government is involved. Obviously, One could think about the health sector. Obviously, our populations are aging. They are in need of greater and better access to healthcare. And it's obviously an area in which the pandemic reminded us how important it is for the well-being and the security of our people. But there are also other areas in which the government will certainly be more involved in the years coming. One area, which is not a bad thing in that particular case either, is the public investments that will be needed to address the energy transition, to fight the consequences of climate change. As you know, an important portion of the recovery plan, which was included in the Canadian 2021 budget, an important portion of it is dedicated exactly to that, to the energy transition, to measures that will aid in fighting climate change. And the same is true, obviously, of the infrastructure bill that has just been signed by President Biden in the United States. And these involve billions and billions of dollars of investments over the years. Now, this being said, it's not that we're doing much more than in any other places in the world. I think that Europe, in that respect, is doing slightly more than what we're doing in North America in that respect, but at least it's going in the right direction. So one of the big change brought by the pandemic, obviously a huge involvement of our governments, and part of it will stay. I really think so. Now, as I just been saying, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you spend that money and if you address what are our challenges coming in the future. But at the same time, there might be also some caveats that need to be mentioned. And one of them is obviously, and it's natural, and it's true in almost all of the countries I know, when the government gets involved, the government has natural protectionist instincts. It's quite normal. It's quite natural to any action taken by a government. The government thinks about its populations first, its businesses first, the sectors that are represented in its regions first. So it's only natural that governments, when they get involved, are by instinct, I would say, protectionist. And this might be a problem. This might be a problem not only for Canada, but also for the United States. And this is something, obviously, you probably see where I'm heading now with my comments, right? Because even I mentioned Europe and the efforts that Europe was doing with the Next Generation EU fund on the climate change front, for example. I said that they were doing more. It's not that in North America, we're aspiring to have the same kind of institutional architecture for our integration that they have in Europe. Of course not. It's not the intention here. But at the same time, geography, the investments that have been made over decades by our businesses, the rules that have been negotiated by our governments have made for a very integrated economic space that binds our populations and workers together. Of course, and because of that, it's going to be very important in those investments that we're making in the future to keep in mind this very integrated nature of our continental economy. You see, the Canada-US-Mexican trade agreement, the successor of NAFTA, which has just been negotiated, and it was not an easy thing to do, at least for Canadian and Mexican, in the particular context in which we had to do it, provide some rules for the future that guide investments into the future. And Lisa mentioned the very practical problems that could be brought by those subsidies on EV vehicles. And you see where the things are linked together here. We are investing for the future. We are addressing the challenges that our societies face in the future. And that would be, and I think it's my main message today, it's very important that we address those issues and that we're doing those investments by, at the same time, respecting the rules that we've agreed and signed on to, because this is what will make our integrated North American economy more resilient. And don't forget that even if we are not integrated as other parts of the world like Europe, we are competing with the other areas of the world in those critical new businesses that we're creating And I think that as we proved in the past, if we think about those things together and plan together and respect the rules that we have established together, we'll only be stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Very good. Very, very insightful. The implications of, I hesitate to say permanent, but ongoing, continuing, substantial government involvement for the Canada-US relationship are quite profound and much appreciated. To hear your perspective on that certainly creates an interesting context. So thank you again. I'm sure that will spike some interest in the Q&A period to follow. Next, I'd like to call on Catherine Friedman, who is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Canada Institute and served as the Canada lead and North American co-lead on then Vice President Biden's foreign policy team when he was running for president. She advising the campaign on all things bilateral, all things Canada-US. She's also a member of the faculty, research faculty at the University of Buffalo. And I'm sorry to learn that she's going to be retiring soon and next month, later this year, to start her own law firm focused on Canada-US law and policy issues. So thank you for being with us, Catherine, and welcome. Look forward to your perspective.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And I want to thank everybody for asking me to participate in this panel discussion. Like everybody else on the panel, I'm a firm believer in the strength and the integrity of the Canada-US relationship. And I am honored to share my perspective with everybody here this afternoon. I've been an observer of the Canada-US relationship for a little more than 15 years now. And I've witnessed our countries move through some good times and navigate some pretty rough patches. At its foundation, I tend to think that the relationship is sound and strong. I think that there continue to be important areas for Canada and the United States to collaborate on. I think the two Michaels are one example that comes to mind. Collaboration behind the scenes, but very strong collaboration between our countries. And I think that kind of collaboration, there are opportunities for that kind of collaboration in the future. One notable example is mining rare earth minerals. This is an area that I hear discussed quite a bit in circles in Washington, D.C. and in Ottawa. China has become, as many of you know, the world's top producer of rare earths, which are critical to, manufacturing and high-tech industries. Canada, is not in that space yet, but Canada has some of the largest reserves and resources in the world of these rare earths. And both Canada and the United States are figuring out how to invest in this industry to extract some of those rare earth minerals in an effort to counter the rise of China in this space. Another area that Canada and the US are talking about in terms of collaboration is supply chain security and collaborating on and reshoring and strengthening supply chains in our very integrated economies, as Martin just suggested. So that's another important area of collaboration and cooperation. And there are more that, I'm sure some of the other panelists will discuss. But as mentioned, certainly alluded to by former Minister Raitt, there are irritants. And the former minister mentioned the electric vehicle tax credit as well as Line 5. And I'm not really going to delve into too much detail on those two issues, but I would like to round out and perhaps reinforce some of former Minister Raitt's points with regard to the border and border policy. I am here in Buffalo, New York, right on the border. And I can tell you, it has been a significant irritant to the relationship, and in particular to cross-border stakeholders all along the 49th parallel. So we all know that the Canada-US border has historically been approached in a collaborative manner. Again, as former Minister Raitt suggested, there were great mechanisms in place in the past that really helped shore up the Canada-US relationship vis-a-vis border policy. And although our two countries coordinated our response to the pandemic by mutually closing the border in a show of diplomatic spirit in March of 2020, that really was the last public showing of any sort of coordinated approach to the border during the pandemic. And I appreciate that both countries are not only trying to balance trade and security, but now there's a third element added to the mix, which is public health. So when you think about the bureaucracy that had to be created in the post 9/11 environment, prior to 9/11, the border was, for all intents and purposes, inconsequential. Trade flowed, people flowed, and there weren't many significant irritants when it came to the border. Post 9/11, policymakers in both Canada and the United States had to balance trade, free flows of people, goods, and services with security. And again, now I think that the pandemic has really ushered in a new era of border policy, with officials having to balance trade, security, and again, as I said earlier, now public health. We know that Canada opened its borders before the United States, earlier than the United States reciprocated to Canadians. And again, there are different rules in place that, quite frankly, people find very confusing when it comes time to cross. Many people who have friends and family, loved ones, and even livelihoods on both sides of the border are increasingly frustrated at the lack of coordination, at the lack of policy coordination that still exists today when it comes to the border in the, post-pandemic world. Although again, I'm not sure we're post-pandemic, but we seem to be moving. We certainly have moved through the first couple of waves. Over the summer, when the pressure by stakeholders on both governments was turned up, I was increasingly asked why, one, the border wasn't opening, and two, why we were not coordinating with Canada. It didn't make sense to observers of the Canada-US relationship to keep the border closed. And again, it certainly didn't seem to make sense to folks living in cross-border communities all along the 49th parallel. One point that I think we have to keep in mind, and again, it was mentioned earlier, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about it in a minute, but at least on our side of the border, President Biden's commitments are to, understandably, domestic policy and domestic politics. And when it came to the border and border policy and conversations regarding lifting the restrictions, on the Canada-US border, maybe before the US-Mexico border, there were some in the president's orbit who really felt strongly that the administration needed to wait until the restrictions were lifted or could be lifted simultaneously at both borders. And again, for those of us on the border, that doesn't really seem to make sense as to why the borders were treated differently. But, when you think about folks in Washington looking at the situation from more of a North American perspective, it did sort of make sense to wait, much to our chagrin. I'm not suggesting that I necessarily agree with that, but there was some method to the madness, so to speak. The logic was both borders were closed at the same time. So the theory was that they should be opened at the same time as well. And again, what we're really seeing coming out of Washington, D.C. is a focus on domestic politics and domestic policy. I would almost suggest at the expense of foreign policy, even with our dear neighbors to the north. And this is occurring at least in my 15 years. It's unprecedented. Here in the United States, we have border policy, we have Buy American, we have the electric vehicle tax. I just think it's the times that we live in. And although I do believe, I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, but I do believe that there seems to be a true fondness between the Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden. I can't imagine that either one of them would put, that fondness or that friendship over the interests of their countries, particularly at this point in time. So at the same time, we have all of these domestic pressures with our leaders turning inward. And I would say that Prime Minister Trudeau is also experiencing those domestic pressures. We also see an interest on the part of China, for example, trying to put a wedge between Canada and the United States at any turn. We also see Russia taking every opportunity it has to exploit domestic political divisions and democracies across the globe. So while it's important for our countries to focus on domestic politics and domestic policies, and indeed the largest domestic crises since the Great Depression, I do believe that it is absolutely imperative for Canada and the United States to continue to try to find ways to work together in the foreign policy space. Perhaps the relationship needs more than tending to the weeds, as former Secretary George Shultz once said. Perhaps, as former Minister Raitt suggested, the relationship needs to be institutionalized a little bit more, particularly with regard to the border and issues on the border file. But I do think at the end of the day, it does require more attention from policymakers in DC and in Ottawa in order for us to collectively strengthen prosperity over the next couple of decades for generations to come. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine, very much indeed. You've illustrated or given voice to a few kind of interplays that we all need to bear in mind. The importance of collaboration, but there are irritants from time to time of various sorts along the way. It has always been that way, no doubt always will be to some degree. The importance of working together at the international level, I think we all understand that. But there are domestic priorities that have to come first, especially for people, I suppose, who are dependent upon votes, and voters to keep doing what they do. And you have to make the voters happy and keep them that way, or at least not make them too angry. So in lots of ways, it's a dynamic and evolving, but a really, really important relationship. Thank you for illustrating that yet again. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Trevin Stratton. Trevin's with Deloitte Canada, where he's the national lead of their economic advisory practice. He too has a PhD from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies. And prior to joining Deloitte, he was the chief economist and senior vice president of policy for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Ottawa. And before that, head of the economic development practice at BDO Canada. He's also served as a faculty member at the American University of Dubai. Interesting. And a real internationalist, and as a fellow at the American Institute of Economic Research at Yale University. Trevin, thank you very much for being here. Look forward to your remarks.
Oh, thanks for the kind introduction, Stephen, and thanks to all the organizations involved for the invitation. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, as you mentioned. I'm based in Canada. I'm based in Ottawa, and I'm a Canadian, but I've lived quite a few years in the United States. My wife is American as well, and so I think that this topic is very important to be speaking about, particularly as things are changing right now. So as going forth amongst the speakers, it's always a challenge to kind of come up with something that someone hasn't already said, and to say something new. And so what I thought I would do maybe is to broaden the lens a bit, and to focus on the global context in which Canada-US relations are changing or evolving, as the title of this topic is. And that should hopefully give us an idea of the reasons why some of the changes are taking place between Canada and the United States right now. So I think something that's very important to keep in mind when we're talking about foreign policy, foreign affairs, when we're talking about the global economy, is that the structure, both politically or geopolitically and geoeconomically, of the world is changing right now, and it probably has been for at least a few years. So since the end of the Cold War, at least at the earliest, there's been this wave of international economic, political connections, globalization, for lack of a better term, that we saw in terms of increasing trade flows between countries, increasing capital flows between countries, increasing migration between countries as well. And what we are probably seeing, particularly during the pandemic, an acceleration of, but might have started before that, is a bit of a, maybe not reversal, or reversal in some ways, but at least a slowing of that trend, which in itself is a reversal because it's, the trend is no longer there. And not all of this started with the pandemic. I mean, after the financial crisis in 2008, global trade flows were still increasing, but not nearly at the same pace as they were prior to that. Global capital flows, we can say the same thing. If we look even before the pandemic at Brexit, or some of the changes that took place during the previous US administration when it comes to migration as well, there's a bit of a change when it came to labor mobility as well. And so I look at what's taking place between Canada and the United States during the pandemic and looking forward kind of within this context too. And I think that touches upon what Martin was talking about when it comes to protectionism, the size of government, what Lisa was talking about when it comes to protectionism, Catherine when she was talking about supply chains as well. And so during the pandemic, we've seen an acceleration of this. We're seeing this right now with all the talk about the disruption of supply chains. We're seeing this when it comes to international trade. International trade obviously took a huge hit during the pandemic, particularly at the beginning. At the beginning, it was both international trades in goods and services. International goods has rebounded to generally where it was before, but international trade and services is still well below its pre-pandemic level. We see this when it comes to international travel, and obviously that's related to the service sector and within that, the tourism sector as well. And we see that when it comes to borders closing too. And so I say all of this because, what's maybe not very clear, but what we might be seeing right now, and that Canada and the United States needs to plan for, is that the structure of the global economy is changing. The structure of supply chains might be changing as well. And so, we touched upon this a little bit, but we had global supply chains. That's not to say that supply chains aren't going to be international, but one of the questions going forward, or one of the known unknowns, if you will, is whether a change in the structure of supply chains will make them more regional versus more global, or whether a change in the structure of supply chains will make them more national for certain sectors, but more regional or global for other sectors. And we're seeing this kind of play out in the conversation with the United States at right now too. And that's why there's so much focus on things like supply chain resiliency. A lot of governments, Canada, the United States, but outside of it too, the UK, the EU, France, China are certainly talking about industrial strategy, and that is very much related to protectionism that we've talked about too, or at least certain types of industrial strategy is, and industrial policy too. And so what's important is, what this means for the United States and Canada, and what this means for the relationship. And so I think it's, to focus on the United States first, I think a lot of Canadians, including decision makers and policymakers, were hoping that with a new administration, the relationship might not have been the closest between a president and prime minister, or between two administrations during the previous U.S. administration. And we're hoping, that the new administration in the United States would be like a breath of fresh air for that relationship. And in some ways it has been, certainly when it comes to the tone of that relationship. But in some ways, similar types of policies have been put in place. We've talked about about kind of, EV tax credits. We can talk about the Enbridge Line 5 decision, though that might be more at the state level in Michigan as opposed to the federal government, but we'll see how that plays out. And the reason why, some of the policies might have not changed, or at least some of the approaches to economic relationships with Canada haven't changed, even though the administration has, is because of these structural changes that are taking place. And that's the motivation for the United States' foreign policy or foreign economic policy, because the structure hasn't changed, even though the people involved and maybe their approach to foreign policy has. These are still issues that might be in the United States' self-interest when it comes to their approach. And that hasn't necessarily changed. What this means for Canada too, and I would say this for the United States, is that this kind of previous system of a very globalized economy, it benefited all countries, but there are a few countries that benefited more than Canada and the United States, both individually and together. They were involved in creating this type of system. And so what's very interesting is, when we look at what this means for the United States with the way that things are changing, it's an asymmetric relationship between the United States and Canada. The United States is a much larger economy. And so it has maybe not opportunities, but it sees areas in which it can be more protectionist or enact more industrial policies. And it has a market of 330 million people to be able to access, even if it is creating different types of international economic borders with trade and financial flows with other countries. Well, Canada doesn't necessarily have that advantage, right? We have 37 million people. And so the way in which the world is changing and the economy is changing means different things for the United States and Canada. And that's really what we're seeing playing out right now in a lot of these talks that we see taking place, including the summit that took place last week. And so I know that we want to leave some time for questions, so maybe I'll leave it at that, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Trevin. You did a great job of positioning this and making sure that we understand the greater trends that are taking shape. I'm like you. You mentioned you're Canadian, your wife's American. I'm a little bit like that in a different way. I'm Canadian. My dad was American. My mom was Canadian. My brother is American. My dad was a New Yorker, and I remember when I was a kid, we'd drive down and visit his family, and when we crossed the Rainbow Bridge, he became a little more difficult to understand. And by the time we got to Schenectady and were turning down toward Nyack, where he was from, my mom and I, we didn't know what the heck he was talking about. So it's interesting. We have lots of things in common, and some things not quite as in common as we might like or believe. Anyway, yes, thank you all very much. Tremendous presentations. Really, you didn't know what each other were going to talk about, but you nevertheless managed to take some different perspectives and bring some different insights to the table, and we appreciate that very much. Okay, questions. I know there's a hand up from Farzan Sabet, if I've pronounced that correctly. We'll get to him in a minute, but there were one or two that entered the chat room that we want to get to first of all, because they were fast. They were early, excuse me. We had one from Kim, who's a registered nurse at the University of Buffalo. And Kim was interested in something that several of you mentioned. And this is the border and the difference in the treatment at the land border in the two directions, and what Canada is doing at this point versus what the US is doing. And in particular, the business of the testing requirement to enter Canada. Now, this is, of course, changed recently, right? A little bit. Canadians can now go to the United States across the land border, and as long as their trip is less than 72 hours, they can come back without having to get the expensive test. Any idea, anybody, when that might change for US citizens wanting to come into Canada for shorter long trips? Much less anybody else, but I'm sure she was interested in American citizens. Anybody heard any rumblings about this? Nobody knows.
Stephen, I would just
I don't know.
offer that I felt that policy was to fix an unintended consequence of the rules that were put in place. And that was the fact that Canadians, if they were going over for less than 72 hours, would technically have to take their test, their PCR test in Canada before they actually cross the border. So it was logically, it didn't make any sense for that cost to come. But if you're there for more than 72 hours, you are going to have to still provide that PCR test. So it's, I thought it was just to cover off something that made no sense to anybody. And I don't see a big change coming on whether or not that test is going to still continue to be needed.
Okay, very well. Thank you very much. One other question that came in through the chat room is has to do with the Buy America and I suppose in particular the electric vehicle credit that's was just successfully went through the House of Representatives. And our questioner wonders whether that intervention maybe should cause Canada to begin to look at other markets more rather than the United States. If the US is going to become pretty protectionist and pretty self-interested, not that we aren't in Canada too, but us being the smaller player, do we need to shop our wares elsewhere?
Well, I could say a few words about this for the automobile sector in particular, because the general question over whether we should diversify, it's yes, Canada should diversify, should make every effort at diversifying, but that's not an easy thing, right? Because you've got the power of geography, proximity, and the size of the United States market. So this is the biggest market in the world, which is next to the border, right? So even if we had the intention to diversify a lot, there's so much we can do, which is not the same thing as saying that we shouldn't be trying to do that. And actually, we're doing that, right? But it will always be the case that our trade with the United States will remain overwhelming compared to the trade that we would have with any other country of the world. Now, if we come to the automobile sector in particular, this is the example, probably one of the best example of an industry which is essentially organized within regions. So there is no such thing as a world automobile industry. There is one European automobile industry. There is a North American automobile industry. There is another cluster in China. Maybe the rest of Asia is slightly different, but it's generally a cross-regional line. So there's no way that Canada all of a sudden could just say, okay, we're going to export cars to Europe. We're going to export cars or components to China, for instance. It has to remain an integrated industry within North America. And the question here is, can we address the challenges of the future together instead of separately? And this was precisely, I think, our points, because I was not the only one. We all mentioned this issue about the subsidies to the purchase of electric vehicles. Those electric vehicles are the vehicles of the future, right? So can we build those together? I think we could. It's a matter of being aware that there are something which is above the immediate self-interest or perceived self-interest of the country in the name of the greater interest of the North American space, in which, as I said, our lives are intertwined and we're bound together.
Good stuff. Anyone else have a thought to add to what Martin has just offered? Okay, let's go to our hand raiser, Farzan. Could somebody turn on his? There he is.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess it's evening here. Good evening, everyone. I'm based in Geneva and I work for the UN, but originally Canadian. I want to say shout out to Martin Treven, my fellow graduate student alumni. So my question is a little bit more explicitly, I guess, foreign policy oriented. So as I understand it, the process to detain Meng Wanzhou and begin proceedings to deport her to the United States for violations of US extraterritorial sanctions was an automatic one that wasn't necessarily subject to review by senior officials, or at least that's what I've been told by lawyers. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So my question is twofold. Given the questionable international legality and legitimacy of the US extraterritorial sanctions, and specifically the shameful unreliability of the US in showing solidarity with Canada when it experienced backlash from China. How should senior Canadian officials in the future treat such sensitive cases and requests from the future? And is there any possibility to put a political review over the process of legal review? And second, how should they, senior Canadian officials specifically, balance the crucial relations with the United States, which is obviously, somewhat overwhelming in the security, political, and economic sphere, while also benefiting from the fruits of economic and technological ties with China? I'm just thinking specifically, for example, I have a lot of family in Canada working in the field of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and what I understand is that China's made a huge investment through Huawei, for example, in establishing a lot of its R&D infrastructure within Canada. Thank you very much.
The floor is open. Who would like to take the first shot? One of his fellow alumni.
I'll talk the
Trevor.
politics side of it, Stephen.
Okay,
if
you
want.
take it. You take it. Great.
Sure. I'll just start out the first part of the question. Thank you for the question, by the way. The first part of the question has to do with whether senior officials in Canada are going to have a flagging system, I guess, for lack of a better word, for these kinds of extradition requests that come in, if they ever do come in again. Look, I'm not convinced that the minister didn't know that this was going to be happening. And the reason why I say this is within the Canadian system, as many of you already know, the minister has his or her own staff embedded within the department. And the reason why that staff is there is for these situations where it may be a run-of-the-mill kind of, I guess, request that comes into the bureaucratic side, but it has very significant political ramifications. And as a result, it should be flagged to the minister's office and then communicated up to the minister or the prime minister's office as to whether or not they wish to do something in this case. So I would expect, and I would suspect, that the officials in the Canadian government are sophisticated enough to know that they would definitely want to make sure that their political partners were aware of this, given the fact that she is or was so high up in senior management in Huawei, and Huawei was under consideration to be part of the 5G process in Canada. All the red flags around that indicate to me that this is something that would have been flagged. And then the decision taken to follow the advice, which is to follow the rule of law, which is very Canadian of us. And, former ministers who had the same position have come forth to say that, well, we would have done it differently. We would have, given a phone call. I don't know whether or not you can actually go into that kind of analysis after it's happened, but certainly, these kinds of questions will get more thought around the table. The minister always has the option to deal with extraditions. The question is whether or not the detention was one that reached the minister's ears, and I would suspect that it will happen on a going forward basis, and decision calls will have to be made.
Thanks, Lisa. We have another hand up. I'll take this one and then go to another one of the chat room ones. Arjun Singh.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you to all the other panelists for their remarks today. As everyone on this call and watching on YouTube will know, inflation is a top-of-mind concern for most Canadians and Americans, and as a result, it's perhaps the top political issue in both countries right now. A big component of inflation is the rise in gas prices, and to combat that, the president recently announced that he will be releasing oil from the US strategic petroleum reserves to try to ease the concerns regarding supply and reduce those prices. But this comes after he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline on his first day in office, which would have supplied Canadian oil to the United States and would have perhaps in some time in the future reduced these price concerns and supply concerns. So proverbially speaking, is this not a case of cognitive dissonance by Joe Biden and the US administration? And given the political problems right now, is there not a future for Canadian oil to once again be supplied to the United States at a much larger scale than it is right now?
Who wants to have the first crack at that one?
I can try a first crack, but not necessarily the definite answer. Maybe there's going to be an addition from another member of the panel. You see, I really think that examples examples such as these, we'll see them all over the world, right? Because these are the difficulties that we face in the energy transition, right? The immediate concerns of people in power who have to face the anger, the anxiety, economic anxiety of their population is one thing. At the same time, they have to engineer that energy transition, support that energy transition that we need to do in the future. So in the short term, we still depend very much on fossil fuels, right? And we know that we have to depend less and less and less on fossil fuels, but this is not something done easily, right? So we're going to go through phases like this where you will see politicians seemingly in contradiction with themselves, not only in the US or in Canada. You're going to see that in Europe as well. And you see that right now in India, and you see that right now in China with coal. They were supposed to use less coals for energy power in China, but now there was a problem with there were power outages in China, and they had to reverse these things for a while. So it's not something specific to the US. I think it's certainly not specific to the Biden administration. Think about France and the yellow vests. You're going to see many, many, many examples of this in the years to come, I think.
Thanks, Martin. Anybody else like to add a thought there?
I mean, I would just echo Martin's comments and just suggest that in my view, we really are living in an extraordinary time where all of our institutions, economic, social, political, are under stress. I think that we are in this transition period, and I think, again, everyone, can certainly strive for consistency with regard to various policies, but the reality is just very, very different. And again, to Martin's point, short-term interests is long-term interests are sometimes going to clash.
Hey, thanks, Catherine. You froze a little bit there at the very end, but appreciate your contribution. I've been alerted that there's another speaker or another participant who would like to ask a question. John Camerata. John, are you there? There he is.
So there we go.
There you go. Thanks, John.
Oh, great.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic, and thank you so much. I am in Waterloo Riding, and hello, Lisa. I'd just like to say we met a long time ago, and if anybody should have been Prime Minister of Canada, it should have been Lisa. I'm telling you, a great person there. That's my little campaign motion there. But she's a terrific person, and I'm glad to see so many people involved in this discussion from different perspectives, and my mind's just overflowing. I am a graduate alumna from the University of Buffalo, Graduate Studies in Education and History, going way back. But having lived on the border from Ridgeway, Ontario, half my family's in New York State and half are in Canada. So I have a really understanding of the culture and understanding of American society and people, which I think is part of policymaking that a lot of Canadians just don't comprehend. And I think culture, understanding each state, the federal system versus Republican system, is so much different. And I think that's important. And I also think what's important in decision making is elections 2 to 3, 4 years. So policy cannot be long range in many ways, because the impact is on whether or not I can get reelected. So I think there's a very practical point of view of retaining position and power that has to be addressed eventually. However, my point, I think, deals with, and I think from a negotiating point of view, being from Cambridge, Kitchener-Waterloo region, we have the Toyota International Plant in Cambridge, hires 8,000. We have EV vehicles, EH vehicles made here, and we are the international center for shipping in the United States for SUV vehicles. And we're moving forward. Now, when we think of negotiations and treaties and whatever we want to do, is there not and I'm not sure who can answer this, is there not subtle negotiations going on right now? Because Toyota is a multi-billion-dollar corporation with plants in 5 states, 4 or 5 states, plus 1 in Canada, plus worldwide, who makes cars and ships them to United States, depending on the model. Some are made in the United States, parts are shipped to the United States. With this new, you might say this new restrictions on trade and incentives, can cars not be sent over to the United States and assembled? So if we make batteries in Canada, is there an option negotiating going on with Toyota in the United States, in the world? Because we're talking a major billion-dollar corporation. How in reality are negotiations going to address their concerns and their needs in order to continue to hire thousands of Canadians, thousands of US citizens, and maintain some sort of normality? I'm sorry it takes so long for the question.
Well, John, you've illustrated the problem in a very precise and localized way. So it's very pragmatic. Of course, I think there are lots and lots and lots of talks going on. Who's negotiating with whom? The thing's gone through the House of Representatives, not yet the Senate. And who knows what might happen there, and who knows what discussions are going on in the background in the meantime. I certainly don't. I don't know if any of our panelists have deeper insights.
Well, John, thank you for your very kind words. I'm out of politics, though. Thank you, and don't try to drag me back in.
Okay.
I have more fun talking about it than as opposed to practicing it. Look, I think you bring up a really good point of view. One thing we cannot be is the natural resource provider of all of those critical minerals. You know, the U.S. Geological Survey has put out a list of 50 critical minerals and materials. 13 of them are in Canada. And we can actually supply more than those 13, but we just can't be shipping it across the border for it to be processed and manufactured from there. So any Canadian government is going to try to put a line in the sand on that. Whether or not some of those kinds of negotiated points you bring up are going to be incorporated, I think really depends upon how will the United States treat this tax credit, meaning who gets the tax credit and who doesn't. There'll be a list of cars, there'll be a list of plants, and there'll be arguments made as to whether or not this has too many Canadian parts for it to be rendered as an American-made, labor-made vehicle. And that's where the real skirmish is going to come in, and that'll be a battle should this proceed the way that it goes. So that's why you're seeing the Prime Minister in every moment of possibility brought it up with the president in his one-on-one. I mean, even if they were on a different topic, he would try to bring it back to this. Mm-hmm. It has a significant impact on the Canadian economy and on the future of Canada's economy.
Yeah, I'll just add to that obviously part of the USMCA or CUSMA negotiations was rules of origin rules, and specifically related to the auto industry as well. And so with some of these tax credits, if production changes from one border to another for different parts of the supply chain, then how will that impact the kind of rules of origin will be? And I think that really touches on what Lisa was mentioning as well.
Great, thank you.
So. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your question, John. Thank you, Lisa and Trevin, for your responses. We have lots more questions, but what we don't have more of is time, unfortunately. So I'm going to have to draw this to a close. I hope the great participation and the active participation, including lots and lots of questions for our wonderful panel, will show the folks at the University of Buffalo that this was a good idea, and I hope we can do more of it in the future and see more of these things from you. And wouldn't it be nice if we could welcome back some of the same panelists to join us again? So with that, I would like to thank all of the panelists, our hosts, and especially those of you who took the time over your lunch hour to spend some time with us and contribute to a really stimulating discussion. Thanks, everyone. Any final words, Eric, from your side?
No, Steve, thank you for your moderation today. Again, thank you to the presenters, and we will take you up on your offer, Steve. The University of Buffalo will be more than happy to co-host future panel discussions along these lines. We have a long way to go, but we do look forward to the partnership with our Canadian partners. So thank you for those words.
Okay, all the best, everyone. Thank you. Have
Thank
a
you.
great afternoon.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe, everyone.
Take care.